Good afternoon, everybody. It's Friday afternoon, and giving you this teaching orientation for our discussions on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. We'll be meeting once again in our simple churches. Um, the group that meets with Scott and Tom will be meeting with my group in the auditorium, so be prepared for that. And the other two groups meeting over in the Ed building with Jonathan and Larry's group, as well as Mark and Howard's group. So those are in the usual places, and plan to be there. An important conversation this week as we lead into things developing for us in the end of the month. Just a reminder that in 2 weeks, on November the 14th, we will be having our community Lord's meal, but it will be in the evening on Sunday. So we won't be gathering in the morning of that Sunday, but give you time to prepare and get ready for a wonderful evening together. We're going to be celebrating together, and I'll bring some news from Build's conference that I'll be at over the course of this week. So I leave right after our gathering on Sunday morning this week to spend a week out there, meeting with leaders from around the country. And Matt Anderson from Patterson, who I've been working with for years, will be out there with me. I'll get to spend some time with Emma and stay in her apartment with her and just see how she's doing. Engage with the Burns family that and Bill, and who works with Bill out there, and just kind of represent Albania and Holland, Ukraine, the work that's there. Those leaders aren't able to come this year, so I'll be representing all them, especially after this last trip, and how we're moving ahead with plans for church-based theological education. And the topic we have for this week, and what I'm going to share with you now, is really, really big idea. Really, I'll just be frank with you. So don't worry if you don't get all of this. And if the reading seems really, really dense and complicated, that's okay. I struggled with this for a number of years until the lights went on. And so I just hope you really, really get a sense that there's really something significant here, and you want to pursue it even more. And we'll do that together. But I want to give you an orientation to that. And so just hang in there, and you'll be reading in this little booklet that we're following, The Churches of the First Century. And this week, we'll be really completing our study and talking about the idea of a complex network. The complex network of the early church. And that starts on page 32 and takes you through to quite a bit of reading this time, all the way into about page 57. So 32 to 57. Give yourself some time to look at that. And again, just become familiar with it. Don't try to master everything there, but try to really grasp one significant thing and come with a question about something as you come on Sunday, or forward it to me or to your simple church leader. One of those things. Be an important conversation, and we'll carry it into the following week a little bit, but this is a really significant conclusion to this particular encyclical, which again is the idea of a circular letter. We're part of a global network of churches who are looking to return to the way of Christ and the apostles, and using and developing tools for them in order to create networks like the complex network of the first century churches. And we've talked about the small meetings and gatherings, even the centrality of the meal. So we've talked about the smallest part of that network. Now we're talking about all the component parts, the biggest picture of the thing. So let me get into that. But one more thing before I move on, and that is this, going to church in the first century. We looked at this in our last Lord's meal. I would encourage you in the week ahead, not for this Sunday, but between this Sunday and the following Sunday, sit down and read this again with a cup of coffee, 15, 20 minutes, not a heavy read, maybe more for some, I guess. I think it was probably longer than that, but anyway, get a hold of that and look at it again, and just refresh your mind on put yourself in the actual setting of how the early church was gathering, because this is going to be really relevant to our Lord's Meal meeting on the evening of November the 14th. And that'll start about 5 o'clock and go to about 7:30. So plan for that time. And you'll be bringing food as usual. That's what we usually do on those Sundays, first of the month. But this time we'll be doing it in the evening. So rather than having that big meal early on in the day, we'll be having it at a more appropriate time with dinner time. So we'll look forward to doing that and having that time together. Let me share my screen with you and just take you through the orientation of things here today, and try to get at some of these ideas of what it means when we put all this together in a network. What is a network? How does it work? And what is its significance? Let me just start with a little bit of a story. The conference that I'm going to next week is an annual conference, and wasn't able to be there last year because of COVID, but will be this year. And this is normally a time when much of my Albanian team and leaders from around the world gather together in Ames, Iowa, where Build International's headquarters. That's the organization that we partner with, that I have been trained by many, many years ago before going to Albania, and then continued on since then. And they are the ones that have been really instrumental in trying to direct and guide and develop resources that take us back to the way of Christ and the apostles. Not something that they've invented, but something that's there in the New Testament that needs to be understood and uncovered and studied, and then thought through in terms of applying it into our lives and our ministries today. This encyclical was presented in 2009. And in 2009, I had been here at Grace Church for the better part of a year in the lead pastor position, leading the team here, and was still really feeling like getting my feet wet and understanding the nature of our ministry here together, and trying to think through, where things were going. The church had been involved in leadership training on the ground for years, and many had been a part of that, and some had gone on to other things, but many were here, Jonathan being one of those since before the time he was married with Esther, and had been part of this early group of leaders and has emerged through that. And much like my experience, I was in a local church in Colorado, minding my own business, learning how to be an architect, and got involved in this training at the invitation of a pastor, and started studying these things, kind of the things that you guys have done in First Principles and these big leadership courses that you see behind me here, that some of you are familiar with. And through all that, began to understand that there was something going on in the New Testament, that it tells a story that I was not aware of because I was blind to it. I was not aware of it, and really thought about the New Testament as something that God would, had there specifically for me, a collection of blessed thoughts. Really, the most important thing was about my walk with Jesus, and everything else was sort of secondary to that. As long as that was okay, everything was okay. And then came to realize through this training, holy cow, that's not what the New Testament is about. And that's not what Jesus intended to do. There's a plan here that every generation has to discover and organize and orient itself around, and to get on board with it if we're to be faithful to Jesus's plan and calling, and the work that apostles generation was doing, especially Paul. Just what kind of blew my mind to realize that was there. And I remember a similar experience when I was at the conference where this particular encyclical was presented, after having been here for a year at Grace Church, kind of thinking about how we fit into the big picture of things, because it was just, here we are, one local church doing our thing, training leaders. Yeah, now I'm continuing to work with Albanians. We've got the Turkish church that was probably getting underway at that time, or the Spanish church was meeting with us, but we're all kind of doing our own thing. And the idea and the understanding that the New Testament tells the story of a network of churches, and that was the intention. Jesus intended to create a network of churches, and all the stuff that we need to build a network like that, and to understand how a network like that works, and how leaders work, and how training works, and how people are saved, and how churches are formed, and how they multiply, and how problems are solved, and how poverty in one part of the world is solved in one from another part of the world, and how churches work together and leaders move around. All that came together in this encyclical, and it was obvious to me, wow, that's what we're supposed to do. Grace Church is supposed to be a part of and help build a network of churches that will help transform Clifton, Patterson, and Passaic by working together, being in different areas and maybe being speaking different languages, but all having the same common understanding, the same base of the gospel, the things that God has done for us, and then the Didache, the apostles' teaching, how we need to respond to what God has done for us, and get us all together in that plan, but doing our own part of that plan, but based on that same set of teaching, the gospel and the apostles' teaching, or the Kerugma and the Didache, as we come to talk about it. And it changed everything. I came back so enthusiastic from that conference, realizing I know what we need to do. We need to build a network. We got to figure out how to start making that happen, and praying about it. And I started asking you to pray about churches. And every week on the back of your bulletin, there's a church in Clifton that I'm asking you to pray for, because my hope is that one day that church will become part of one of these networks, doing the kind of things and learning the kind of things that we are learning, so that we can work together in a way that we can begin to transform and change and plant other churches, and really see some of the problems in our area, just really bring the kingdom of God, just cause it to explode in the area. That's not magical. That's something that can happen by us being faithful to Jesus's plan and understanding it and getting others involved in it. And so not long after that, things began to emerge in Patterson. Years ago, when I first came here, I wanted to meet the leader of Star of Hope there, and I had gone with him with some of the ideas about how we were training leaders and how I had been trained, and I gave him that. And he, like most people, convinced to put it in a filing cabinet somewhere. And several years later, I got a call from him in the middle of the day and said, "Steve, I have to apologize." I said, "Jay Sinclair is his name." I said, "Jay, what's wrong? You gave me this manual on training leaders, and I just uncovered it again, and someone else suggested that I think about it, and I realized you had given me this, and it's been sitting in my drawer for years, and this is exactly what we need to do. This is what the churches in Patterson need. Can we get together and talk?" And that was the genesis of the work that we're now doing in Patterson, and trying to train a number of leaders to build this kind of network there. And now Star of Hope is at the center of that. And so that's begun to take some shape. There's a lot of work to be done, and imagine a similar kind of thing in Clifton and Patterson and Passaic. This 3-city area, which is just really interesting when you look at it geographically. You got the Watchung Mountains behind us here, and the cliffs and Garrett Mountain Park, and the Passaic River runs around us here. You can really get your arms around it and say, wow, I can imagine a network of churches in that area, and different kinds of leaders and churches, and speaking different languages and reaching different kinds of people. That's what Jesus was praying for in John 17. And we have the means to do that. And we have all the ingredients and the instructions that we need to do that in the New Testament. And that's what we're doing when we go back to and rethink and reimagine how it is we even meet together in a way that will build that kind of a direction. So these are exciting things, and I get excited about them, and I should, leaders that work at an apostolic level across churches really resonate with this, but all of us need to understand that that's what we're part of, and that's what Jesus has brought us into, and we have a role to play in it. And everything you do matters, as individuals, as families, and for us as churches, and as a network of churches, matters in Jesus's plan. Every one of you, without exception. And that includes the churches that are not yet part of what we're doing, and how we're trying to form relationships with them. So let me move forward and just try to move through some of these ideas and get you oriented to them. So we saw this back early on when we started this. This is a map that represents the existence of local churches, or actually networks of churches. Each one of these red dots represents a city where there was probably a number of house churches networked together. So What you see here is a network of churches that had been planted by the apostles, and a lot of them by Paul in the in the middle part of the first century, and some by Peter and the other apostles, and some by John, or those guys were working among them. And so this is what you have, and it's each one of these dots represents a cluster of churches or a network of churches within a city, 7, 8, who knows how many house churches, but they're all connected together. And then the cities themselves are connected together by virtue of the teams and the leaders that would move around among them. Paul is over there in Antioch, which is up in the corner of the northeastern Mediterranean, and then moves around to Asia Minor, that part of Western Turkey today, and even over into Europe, Corinth, Athens, Thessalonica, right on the edge of Albania today, and then eventually makes its way to Rome. And so all of these things have in common the teaching they received, the gospel they received, the apostles' teaching they received, and the leaders that worked among them, and the leaders that were trained in them, the elders and the deacons, and just all they had a common experience and things, even though we're in very, very different places, and it created a network. This is what Jesus had been praying for, that by the work of the Spirit and people following and obeying him into his new community, that he'd begin to bless all the families of the earth, just as he had promised to Abraham. And so this is the expression of what Jesus had been praying for and what God had planned for from the very, very beginning. This network of churches that was the first model and is the model of the New Testament that we look back to and say, oh, we need to do something like that or be part of something like that wherever we are. That's what Jesus intended. That's his design. From the littlest part of this, the smallest part of this, the actual gathering in the home, to the whole connection of all the churches in the cities together and the leaders moving among them. That's what we're a part of. This is what Jesus is building. When Jesus said, I will build my church, this is what he meant. He didn't mean a local church. And when I came back from that conference, I realized, and I was somewhat repentant, Lord, I've only ever thought about our church, and very, very little. Our church has to be part of other things and be connected. A church is not a silo. A church is not a singular entity that does its own thing. And that's the problem with most of our churches in America today. They act as if they're the only church in the whole country, or the whole church and only church in the city. And it is not helping the progress of the gospel, and it's not changing our society. We have to change that. You have to change that in the way that we gather. You have to change that in the way we think about the church. You have to change that in the way we think about leaders, and have to change that in the way we think about teaching and training and how we work together. That is crippling. That's why the church is not having an effect in our society and our world today. We have more churches than ever, and we have more resources than ever, and more radio and more all kinds of stuff, but we're not making a difference. Why? We're not one, we're not connected, and we're not unified in holiness and truth according to Christ's plan as we should be. This will unlock that, and we're in the midst of engaging and doing that here at Grace Church. So let me go forward here too. So why did the church expand so much? What happened when it took the wrong turn about 1500 years ago with Constantine? Can we go back and decode the DNA? Can we understand the architecture or the ingredients of this network, so that where the gospel is really, really going like gangbusters in other parts of the world, we can help them build according to that pattern, and we can get back to it here in the West, which is now post-Christian. We are not a Christian society, or not a Christian culture. We are post that. We are beyond that, after that, and people are not solely identifying themselves as Christians, or as us as a Christian nation. And we have an opportunity to reshape the way people think and experience in that. He mentions this book Length in the encyclical, and it's simply a secular book, a book that's about how connections are happening in our world. Everything in the world is connected. You probably learned in science class, and I remember, in biology, how, you do something over here and it affects everything over there. If you, anything you do in one part of a network affects the other things, that everything is interrelated. So that stuff all matters. And you got to understand the whole and what happens when you tinker with the parts, because it will affect the whole. And one of the things this author identifies, he's a Hungarian author, when he looks back over history, the first really recognizable network that functions like the networks we have today, like the internet or cellular networks or other things like that, was the network that Paul built. It has all the ingredients of what scientists now can identify as network science or network components. This is genius. This is what the Spirit was doing through Paul well before we ever understood what a network was. That's what God was inspiring and doing after Jesus' finished work on the cross and the power of his resurrection and the leading of his Spirit that we see in the book of Acts. It's incredible to see it that way. This idea of a complex network is challenging, but it's really, we have to understand it. That's what we're a part of, and be able to operate and function within it. And leaders absolutely must master these ideas. This is one of the biggest tasks we have in places like Albania and Kosovo, is for leaders to get out of this idea that it's all about their church and just what they're doing, and those other connections don't matter. And how God uses those. It is they've caught that disease from us here in the West, that everybody doing their own thing is okay, and God is pleased with that. He is not. That is not building according to Christ's plan. Building according to this network plan is Christ's plan, because that's what we see in the book of Acts. So there's 3 examples in Acts that we have. As you read through Acts, we have the city of Antioch and the beginning of the development of this network, and then eventually the city of Ephesus and the city of Rome. These are strategic places, and a network always has what you would call strategic hubs or strategic centers. I often like to think about it as the idea of strawberry plants. Many of you maybe know how strawberry plants grow. You plant one plant, and I could give you an example in our backyard. I only planted maybe 8 plants a few years ago, and they're everywhere now. You put a center down and with its roots, and it sends out runners. It sends out runners. Some of those runners become another very strong, healthy plant that sends out more runners. So what you have is a recreation or a replication of this central plant that then becomes has all these satellites come off of it. And some of you know house plants that are like that. But there's always one that's really strong and takes roots, sort of takes over and creates a new center or a new hub in another place. That's what we see in these strategic cities in the book of Acts. The Pauline cycle shows us how this develops. And we've looked at this before. And again, I've told you guys for years, you should be seeing this in your sleep. This is the way to describe the work of the mission of Jesus. This is the work that Paul and his team did. This is the work that leaders working among the churches, global leaders who participate with local churches are to be doing today. They need to do 3 things at the same time, simultaneously, and constantly be doing them over and over and over again. Evangelizing strategic cities, establishing local churches, getting them all grounded in the gospel and the lifestyle that comes out of the gospel, and then entrusting those to faithful men, whether they're leaders of those local churches or leaders that will come out of those local churches and join Paul's team or join a team to go start other churches or go to the next strategic city or other places. This is a motor that creates a network of churches. This doesn't just create one local church. This creates multiple churches and causes a network to grow. And that's why it's important that these things are going all the time. These arrows matter. Those things feed one another and generate the kind of leaders and the kind of dynamic where other churches are started. And this is the strategy that the Holy Spirit gave to the team that came out of Antioch and planted all those other churches from Jerusalem all the way around to Rome that you saw in the chart earlier. You see this chart in your book. Quick explanation of it. It's sort of the big picture of the New Testament. It tells you what this complex network was about. So on the left hand, you have a church in a city. And a church in a city is really a number of small gatherings some very small, some larger, depending on the homes that they were meeting in or the nature of the people that were gathering, but a cluster of those. And they were all connected together by virtue of the leaders. So that cluster of churches, each one of them had an elder and a deacon and some key women working in them. But there were leaders like Timothy or Titus that were moving around among them. And that's what made that network in that city. But then you had city-based churches. And so you had some major cities like Ephesus, Rome, and Antioch that had some really, really significant, they were big cities. You know, we're in an area where those kinds of churches need to develop, where we're in an area where a hub around New York and New Jersey, this tri-state area has to develop because it's what Paul would do. It's a place where Paul would come to make sure there was a strong network of churches, because a strong network in this area could impact entire regions and even other parts of the world by virtue of the hub of churches and church networks that would be around here. So churches that were all identified. So when Paul writes to the Ephesians, he's writing to not one church in a building. He's writing to a cluster or a network of churches meeting in homes. And he's doing the same in Rome, and the same was happening in Antioch. Antioch was where this first base happened and replicated itself, especially in strategic cities like Ephesus and Rome. Then you have the complex apostolic network that's really, really key to Paul, with Paul and his team. So you have churches in all these areas, but you have a team that's moving around among them. So Paul has a team that might number as many as 95, depending on how you count them in the New Testament in there. Some of them are people who are giving money. Some of them are people who are carrying letters. Some of them are people who are having churches in their homes. Some people are workers with him, like Titus and Timothy. All of these make up a team that's moving around among this network and doing it. Paul says, you need to go here. I'm sending so-and-so here. This guy's coming with that letter here. That's what that stuff in those letters are doing, and the story of Acts tells us. And that's all very, very important stuff, because it begins to tell us how this is supposed to work and how we should pattern our lives and our ministries around that today. We'll all be doing different things in that, but we need to understand we're all part of that one thing. And need to be active in doing what God has called us to do and gifted us to do in each one of those settings. Here you see in Ephesus. Ephesus is that strategic city, one of those hub churches, and all of these churches and clusters, house churches in these cities are connected to what happened in Ephesus. Paul was in Ephesus for 2 years, and by virtue of the number of people that he contacted, they contacted Paul. They got the good news about Jesus. They began to understand the plan of Christ, and they went back and they started churches in their hometowns. So in Colossae and Laodicea, we have a letter to the Colossian church that's directly related to Ephesus. It's why they share some of the same kind of information. Some of these churches are the ones that we hear about in the book of Revelation, the 7 churches. Revelation is a letter that circulates around among these churches, and many of them have a history back to Paul's time in Ephesus there in Acts 17 and 18, 18 in particular. When Paul writes his letter to the Colossians, he said, hey, I've also written a letter to Laodicea and Hierapolis. Make sure you read their letters and make sure they read your letter. So there are letters we don't have that we know about that were circulating amongst these churches. So Paul's letters are tools that are communications that are moving around these churches to correct problems and to get them to understanding the things that they all need to be doing the same. His teaching is the same for all the churches, though it might be directed at specific problems. In Rome, you had larger numbers. So, you might have a single network, but down the road, you had networks of networks to where in a place like Rome, you might have a city network in Rome, but it would be connected to other areas where there were clusters of churches as well. And these were all connected together again by the same teaching, by the same plan, by a team of leaders moving around among them. And you're starting to see how it is that the church began to multiply and spread, especially by nature of these small nodes or these small gatherings, these simple gatherings. Even as low as 2 or 3 people could become another church in another house or in another village. And that's what we're talking about, spontaneous expansion, when a network can grow like this and there's no limits to it. As soon as you put it in a box, put it in a building, put it in an institution, create a hierarchy and a structure around it, you slow this growth down and you stop building a network. God has not designed us to build big churches. He's designed us to build many small churches. You can actually create more believers in a city by being in every neighborhood or in homes and small places in every neighborhood. There could be more believers in a city like that than there ever could be in one building with 2 services or 3 services on a Sunday. That is not how God has designed it to work. And that slows down growth and doesn't create the kind of network that we see in the early church. So you have these elements of networks. The networks have ingredients. It's like anything you build has different parts to it, and those parts all belong together. So you have the nodes and the small worlds. That's the local churches. The churches, like small gatherings, simple gatherings, meeting in homes. You have clusters of those, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of those together. You have hubs and connectors. You have hierarchies and communities, and then you have complex networks where you even have communication going on around among them and a lot of moving parts. So it's very simple at its basic level, but it becomes complex when you put it all together, just like any kind of system that works together. Again, think about the internet. Your computer, your laptop, or your phone is the small node, but it's connected to all the other small nodes in the world by virtue of servers and big data farms and other kinds of things like that. And that network works. You can get information from a server on the other part of the world because you're connected to that network. And cellular networks work the same kind of things. It's a complex network. It has a lot of parts to it, but at its basic level, it's your cell phone in your hand. And think about a local church, a church in a home being like that cell phone, but it's connected to everything else around it. And that's the way God has designed it too. So we're just catching up with what God has had planned and started many, many years ago. We're going to look at the architecture of this, and I'm not going to belabor this too much because you can read that. But again, there's a lot of different things going on, and so there's some complexity to it. So you have the small world of the churches, these simple gatherings, meeting in homes on the first evening of the week around a meal with a discussion time afterwards, and those are all connected together. They sat at the heart of spontaneous expansion. We looked at this a few weeks ago. You have churches to church clusters. So even small cities like Colossae has a cluster of churches, or the island of Crete, you see a number of churches in those cities in Crete. Crete's not a very big island. And then Rome is a big example of that. But they formed, they replicated, some of them even formed on their own from each other, but they connected with one another and became part of this network. Strategic cities became strategic hubs. So you have Rome, Ephesus, and Antioch. You have some later hubs that became really key after the time of the New Testament writing, like Antioch and Alexandria and Carthage. We have even traditions that have come out of those that are still with us today. There are about 31 major cities in the Roman Empire, and there were strategic leaders and churches around them. And this is how the network grew and multiplied. The complex network was shaped and established by Paul and his team. So this doesn't happen on its own. Leaders are entrusted with this plan, and leaders do things and go to different things that evangelizing strategic cities, establishing churches, training up leaders. Leaders doing those things is sort of the gas that makes this thing work. And of course, the ultimate fuel is the work of the Holy Spirit in creating opportunities, but it's also empowering those leaders and doing things even in very, very difficult times. It's God's plan ultimately, but we need to understand that plan and work within it. And leaders especially need to understand it and shape the life of the churches and the lives of believers and their families according to it. So this is all together. So just to highlight that. But how did Paul do this? How did Paul develop this complex network? Well, he gave him a sense of becoming a large network, from the collection of monies from a major relief effort to very personal greetings across the entire network. They knew they were becoming a movement. Paul connected people together, and that's a key aspect of leaders who are able to do that. And he has a vision for that, and a gifting for that, and the Spirit creating some of those things as well. He built a communication network. He sent letters, messengers, visits, greetings, recommendations. He would be all over the internet today and Facebook, and doing all kinds of things to create connections in order to create new churches and strengthen the ones that were already there. So you can see how he was using some of these principles then. He built common practices in all these communities. In 1 Corinthians, intended these practices apply to all the churches. Paul had a practice for how the churches were to gather. We're going to be looking at that. Paul gives us instructions on how the gathering was supposed to look. And as we start gathering this way in evenings or other times in homes around a meal and for a time of discussion or worship together around that meal and that time after, this is what Paul was doing. So all across the empire, because they were meeting this way and the teaching and the leaders were moving around among them, it created a commonality. So what you saw happening over here was happening over here and over here, and it made Christianity strong and vibrant and grow, and everybody was able to see what was happening and experience the new life that Christ was offering. And that's why Paul's letters were saying, these practices in all the churches. This is what I teach to all the churches. This is what you need to hold up to, because this is coming from Christ. So we're not free to design the church and design his network wherever we want to. We have to follow Christ's plan. And it's very, very important. Here's another view of what that looked like. That this is maybe one that makes it a little bit clearer, where you can see the cluster of churches in a city, and networks or clusters of city-based churches that are identified, even like Rome, Ephesus, and Antioch, and then that complex apostolic network, the role this apostolic team moving around among this network in the small gatherings in the homes, but also moving across and even addressing leaders in the city, and taking letters from one place to another and solving problems here and there. So leaders are key in this, both the leaders in the churches themselves and the leaders that move around among them. And that's what that term sodality, modality means. I am a sodality leader. God in his wisdom and his grace has given me a sense and a desire and an understanding of how to work among multiple churches and even across cultures. And that's from God. That's not from me, but I've needed to learn how to grow and understand and work in it. And this has been a really, really key idea. But the whole goal is to create a network of churches. When we go to Indiana, that's what we intend to do too, is to be an extension of what God has started here and is doing among us here. And we think about it that way because it's part of what it's the plan of Christ. This is what we're trying to help leaders everywhere in the world, whether it was Holland or Albania or Kosovo, is to leaders are charged of movements of churches are charged to build these kind of networks according to Christ's plan, and to do the things little and big that will help create this complex network. So it's the big map that we're all working on. He talks about some of the work that leaders need to do, and you can read about that. I won't belabor that too much. Why do we use Build? What is Build International? What is this thing? Why do we connect it? Why is that so important? Well, it is a modern day version. It's a modern day expression of Paul and his team. They have been working and discovering and helping and training others like myself to understand these things and to think through and get tools to be able to do it today. The first principles is a way to help establish us as the smallest part of a network, what we believe about the apostles' teaching and getting that into us and becoming community-oriented around us. We have larger courses, the things that I'm teaching in Patterson right now that help to build an apostolic team. The first principles are to make every believer in the church strong. These courses are to try to help train Titus's and Timothy's and build teams of men and women like that who know and understand how to build one of these networks and how to bring the gospel out and start new churches and get them strong and train other leaders. Then you also have things like these encyclicals, letters that circulate around among churches, other kinds of tools that are ways of communicating these really, really big ideas to get everybody kind of in the same direction and moving and strategizing in the same kind of way across whole countries, across whole languages, and even more. So it's nature a part of my work overseas with the guys that you guys are all familiar with, the work that I've been doing. So some important points here. If we do not take time to establish our churches solidly, seeing that the right DNA is embedded in each of the churches, the first principles of Christ, that's what he's talking about, we cannot expect the network to grow strong, let alone be sustainable. And I would also say too, as we talk about the next encyclical, the way we gather is also part of the right DNA. If we don't get that right, we will not see this kind of network develop that with the opportunity that God has placed us in Patterson, Clifton, and Passaic. If we do not develop leaders, we cannot expect the churches to be able to weather the problems Satan throws at them. This will not be a piece of cake. It is not easy to build one of these things. And all kinds of factors come in and all kinds of things happen. Yeah, like COVID, like, people dying, or conflicts, or all sorts of things. But having this understanding helps us solve those problems and keep on track, even when it seems like things are going well. If we do not build resource center hubs in an efficient and strategic manner, we cannot be able to service all of the churches. So a network is big and complex. That's why you need these hubs like Antioch, like Ephesus, like Rome, where there's a number of leaders and resources and even money to be able to get work out into other areas. And that's why it's so important to build those kinds of things. So think about the role that Grace Church can play by virtue of the buildings we have, and as we grow in size and we multiply our church network here and draw in other ethnic groups, that we get a strength where we can be able to influence and help other churches, even churches around the world. We're doing some effective things as a relatively small church, bigger that go across entire countries, Albania, for example, and Kosovo. And now Holland and Ukraine. We're at the center of those things because it's not about our size. It's about having the right ideas and being very strategic with the resources that God has given us, both in terms of leaders and in terms of money and use of our time and our talents, our treasures. So this stuff really matters and makes a difference. This is what we'll do to get back to the early church. Some of the genius of the network: they were simple, yet designed to mature believers and be attractive to non-believers, creating an easy model for multiplication. The way they gathered and what they did in those gatherings really, really mattered. We're going in that direction. The network structure is pliable, allowing for various parts of the system to evolve on its own, yet having enough leadership and authority to shape the network and its movement as it expands. So when something happens over there and it kind of happens on its own, leaders know, hey, we need to get over there and see what's going on and see how we can make the connections and bring it all part of the same expanding network and growing. So it's very flexible in that way. And it's not something that you can necessarily plan and organize, but you can respond to. And as long as all the parts and all the elements of the network we've talked about here are happening, the network is self-organizing. It's shaped by the gifted leaders using the word to stabilize the parts, correcting mutations, and give the entire network shape. So this is what Paul and his team were doing. This is what his letters were doing. This is what Luke gives an explanation of in the book of Luke and Acts, is how that happened. How did it happen from Jesus to this network that went all the way to Rome with Paul there preaching the gospel unhindered? We got the story of that, and so we can put the picture together and then begin to understand, well, what do we need to do today as well along those ways. So when we set in Acts, what we set in Acts and in the letters of the apostles to the churches is a perfectly balanced, fine-tuned, complex network that amazes scientists just discovering the reality of complex networks, trying to formulate the theory of complexity that is attempting to frame in the map of life. How does it all work? How is it all connected together? Why would we turn to any other way than the way of Christ and his apostles? The genius and the power of God is evident in the way that this network of the early church was created. And we have it right there in the New Testament. And it's what Christ has brought us into and calls us to be a part of and build together. So very, very important. Study this for Sunday, get used to it. We'll talk about the 3 traditions These are three very different traditions. One that was the Antiochian tradition that was built around the way of Christ and his apostles, the New Testament as we have it. The Alexandrian tradition became the way of the academy and institutions, and eventually led to the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Eastern Church that exists today. The Carthaginian tradition went the way of Roman law and became what we know as the Catholic Church today, and its offshoots. But these traditions departed early on, and we've veered away from the Antiochian tradition, which is the tradition of the New Testament. And in the West, we've been primarily formed by the Carthaginian tradition, but also influenced by the Alexandrian tradition and our high value of institutional training and schooling and the academy. And these are both a step away from the way of Christ and his apostles. And we need to get back to that if we're to build the kind of networks and to help new churches in other parts of the world, like China or Southeast Asia or Africa, to build according to Christ's plan. Doesn't take the genius of Western civilization to do this. It takes the humility to recognize that God has given us the plan in the New Testament, and we need to understand it, recognize it, and devote ourselves fully and completely to it. So as we prepare for Sunday discussion time, what do we mean by the network of the early churches? Describe what that is and how we understand it. So describe what a network is. Describe how there's a network in the New Testament. Be prepared to talk about that. What does it mean to address all the churches in a city as one church? That may be a new idea for many of you. How can one church have many churches? What's a city of churches? What's going on there? And then a question is related to us that I'm often challenged by. Grace Church was founded in 1889 and has remained a single local church since that time. How does that compare differently with the pattern we see in the complex network of the first century? How can we as a church return to something more like that pattern moving into the future? A lot of great things have happened, but one of the things that hasn't happened is the development or the shaping of a network like this that we see after all of these years. We have a tremendous opportunity to change that and to build from what's been developed here. God's put us in a very strategic and historic time that we're going to see unfold here in the weeks and months ahead. So that is where we're going for Sunday. And want to just say thanks for, again, your prayers for this week and all that's going on, a lot of changes, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Sunday. I'll get this out to you, posted on YouTube. Take note of those discussion questions at the end, and we'll gather together on Sunday in our simple churches for one more week before we get together all together on Sunday evening, November 14th at 5 o'clock for our community Lord's meal, and really the launch of our beginnings at this development of a complex network. God bless you.